Okay, so now we're going to start in chapter 4, which is talking about ancient Egypt. So we're going to look at the standard, which is analyze characteristics of early civilizations in respect to technology, division of labor, government, calendar, and writings. We're going to discuss the geography of Egypt and examine the early kings of Egypt. And we're just going back and doing this chapter. We kind of skipped over the first 9 weeks, but I felt like we need to go back and cover it. So that's what we're going to do. Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile because without the Nile River, there is no Egypt, because it provides Egypt with the water that they need to have sustainable life. The Nile is the longest river in the world. Ancient Egypt was divided into the Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, and they were separated. It was connected by the Nile. The land closest to the Nile, about 13 miles wide, was fertile, and hundreds of miles of bleak desert were past that. So you have the Nile, and on both sides of it for 13 miles, you have about a 13-mile wide area there where you have good fertile soil where people can live. But on the other side of that is just deserts. And so that's the reason why the Nile was so important for Egypt's existence. This is a picture of the Nile River right here, and you can see that's kind of a map of it. It kind of shows you it goes all the way down to Lake Victoria. With the White Nile and the Blue Nile where they mix, it forms the Nile River. Cataracts are strong rapids. These areas made sailing very difficult on the Nile because some areas have very strong rapids that it's hard to sail into. A delta is a triangle-shaped area of land made of soil deposited by a river, and some 2/3 of Egypt's farmland was in the Nile Delta. This area here makes up very fertile soil that's deposited by the river, and this is going to be like silt, what we talked about in Mesopotamia. So this shows you a map here, and this is the Nile Delta, this little triangle area here that is green right next to the Mediterranean Sea. Most of Egypt is a desert since it hardly ever rains, but rainfall far to the south of Egypt in the highlands of East Africa we call the Nile of the flood. It would back the water up because of the large amounts of rainfall there. This would form silt, making the land very fertile, as I just mentioned. The Egyptians considered the flooding a life-giving miracle and looked forward to them every year. But just like the Mesopotamians, they had to figure out how to control the flooding, because if not, it was going to destroy them, their farms, their houses, everything. Hunter-gatherers moved into the Nile River Valley about more than 12,000 years ago. Similar to Mesopotamia, they developed irrigation systems like canals and things like that control the flow of water so it wouldn't destroy their land. They built canals to store water from the annual flooding so they could use it to their benefit during the year. In addition to the Nile helping to have a stable food supply, it also provided natural protection, making Egypt hard to invade because you're going to have desert on both sides. People ain't going to be coming from the sides. Then you got the Mediterranean Sea to the north and the Nile River. And so people are going to have to come from the north or the south because of this. The protection for the Nile and the Red Sea caused the villages of Egypt to grow. By 3200 BC, the villages of Egypt banded together to form Lower and Upper Egypt. This is going to be the first development of government in Egypt. The capital of Lower Egypt was Pei, and the capital of Upper Egypt was Nekon. The king of Lower Egypt wore a red crown to symbolize his authority, and the Upper Kingdom, they wore a white cone-shaped crown. Menes was the king that was the later one to unify Upper and Lower Egypt. He was the king of Upper Egypt, so he took over Lower Egypt, where he married a princess of Lower Egypt, unifying the two together, and then he had created a red and white crown that would be a double crown that would signify his rule over all of Egypt. Pharaoh is just a title used by the rulers of Egypt. Technically, it's just used of the rulers of Egypt. During this time, they didn't call themselves pharaohs. We trace back to the biblical text of Exodus, really one of the first historical examples of using the term pharaoh, but it's been used of the leaders of Egypt ever since. And these were usually dynasties, a series of rulers from the same family, and he created a new capital to be later named Memphis. The first Egyptian dynasty lasted about 200 years, and pharaohs after Menes also wore the double crown just to show that they had control over both what was Upper and Lower Egypt. Eventually, rivals tried to take over the first dynasty, and this would lead to the second dynasty. Of course, when the first dynasty falls, the second dynasty comes into power. And this is going to be the end of the first section here. It was just a quick little section kind of discussing the geography of Egypt and the early history as we're getting into the Old Kingdom, where you're going to see people like Khufu and people like that come to power. So we discussed the geography of Egypt and the early kings of Egypt as well. So that is the first section of chapter 4.